Hello and welcome back to another episode of Franklin Covey's podcast on leadership with Scott Miller. That's me. I'm your host. 6 years running, 500 episodes taped, where every Tuesday and Friday I am privileged on behalf of the Franklin Covey Company to have fascinating conversations with thought leaders, artists, entrepreneurs, solopreneurs, intrapreneurs, creators, CEOs, titans, you name it, people that have paid the price to join us on this podcast and invest in you as a better leader, perhaps as a leader formally, informally. Maybe it's a role in your personal life as a leader of your own life or family. This podcast is created to make you more effective. Franklin Covey, of course, the world's most trusted leadership development firm, founded in part by one of my heroes and mentor for many decades here in my own almost 30 years in the firm, Dr. Stephen R. Covey. You know him as the author, amongst many books, primarily that of The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Now, this is not a book review podcast, as you know from being a subscriber, but oftentimes, mostly our guests have written a book or 10, or in the case of Deepak Chopra, I think it was like 65. My point is, today, I am honored to have the iconic entrepreneur and what I think is an energy infuser, Jim McCann. You know him as the founder of 1-800-Flowers. He's an entrepreneur and is here today to talk about his most recent book, Lodestar, which he has authored with Dr. George Everly. The title is named Lodestar. We'll talk about the name in just a moment. Tapping into the 10 timeless pillars of success. Jim, welcome to On Leadership.
Well, thank you, Scott. It's a treat to be with you on this wonderful day in Salt Lake City, or so you tell me.
It is a lovely day in Salt Lake City. We're here in the middle of winter, but even in Salt Lake, the sun shines oftentimes in winter. Hey, George, I mean, you are a household name. You were the face of 1-800-Flowers for many decades on television. I feel like I know you. I was raised with you on television, and I'm sure your energy won't disappoint today. What I'm going to ask you to do is rewind a couple of decades, because there's a lot to uncover in your journey as an entrepreneur and how 1-800-Flowers started. We'll talk about the book in a few moments, but for the last souls on earth that were under a rock for 40 years, will you rewind and kind of talk through your journey? Because your journey is not so foreign to a lot of people who started with an idea, did a thing, and then grew it with willpower and perseverance and help into something phenomenal today.
Well, as you guessed, Scott, and as you referenced in your question, it's been a long overnight, as you say. Didn't start out with any entrepreneurial dream. I started out trying, how do I make a living? How do I provide for a family? And in fact, when we started, the word entrepreneur was not used very much. We were small business people. And the neighborhood I grew up in Queens, New York, a neighborhood within Queens called South Ozone Park, which was very much a blue-collar neighborhood. So my role models, the people I saw around the community, were civil servants, a lot of policemen, firemen, shopkeepers, retailers, contractors, plumbers. My father was a painting contractor. So those are the people around. Every once in a while, each block would have someone who would put a suit on and walk 2 blocks to the elevated train and take the train into the city, Manhattan, and did something in an office, but I never really could imagine what they would do all day in an office. So I grew up thinking that I'd probably like to be a policeman, and that was my trajectory. I had a bunch of jobs as a kid. My father had the idea that if you were old enough to walk, you were old enough to work. So I'd work for him and on his job sites if I couldn't find a job elsewhere. And I was highly encouraged to find a job elsewhere, because working for the bosses, as a son of the boss, you did all the work that the men didn't want to do. So it was really crappy work. But you developed a pretty good work ethic. And so I worked in retail, and as an Irish Catholic kid from South Queens, I had a genetic requirement to be a bartender. And indeed I did. And each of the 2 career type jobs/careers I've had both started from a conversation across a bar. First one being working in a neighborhood bar. I had a friend who'd pop in all the time, and he worked in a home for boys. It was a group home, 2-story building with 10 kids in it, and he'd tell me about that work all the time, Scott. And finally he said to me, Jim, you seem like you'd be interested in what I do. Come join us for dinner one night. And I did. And after dinner, Bob asked me if I thought I'd like to give that kind of work a try. And I said, yeah, Bob, I think I would. He said, okay, do me a solid because I have no one to work tonight. And he flipped me a key ring and said, you're on duty tonight, which meant that I'd stay there. I had my own room, and I'd stay overnight, trying to get all the kids to bed, go to bed myself, get up in the morning, get them all after school, and then I'd be off for the day. And that began a 14-year career for me, Scott, that was changed me in so many ways. But it was net a very positive. But you don't make a lot of money as a not-for-profit social services worker.
And then you started to get the taste of sort of an entrepreneurial or small business owner bent. Tell us the story of buying a florist and how that moved into 1-800-Flowers.
Well, again, back to the bar. Now I'm married very young. We started a family very young. And that has consequences in terms of my risk tolerance, and it has consequences in terms of the things you can do. So I had been promoted up through the ranks, and now I lived in a group home for a couple of years, and I ran a group home, then I ran all the group homes, and then I got promoted to be in the administration of this home for boys. So it wasn't a 24/7 job anymore. I go back and get a job on the Upper East Side of New York in Manhattan, working in one of those young people's club kind of places on Friday and Saturday nights, one of those bottle tosses. And late on Friday or Saturday night, there was a fellow who we became friendly with, and he'd chat across the bar and stay late as we were packing up and getting ready to close the place. And he owned the flower shop across the street. And he said to me that he was going to be selling it because he had another business idea he was going to pursue. And I thought, geez, a flower shop. Back in Queens, there was a guy who owned a flower shop on a big corner at an important intersection in my area. He seemed to be quite successful at it. It's working with the public. I've been used to doing that, working in retail for a long time. I thought, well, geez, maybe I'd like to give it a try. And I had bought a building in Brooklyn, in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, and had just sold it. So I bought a building, fixed it up, and sold it, and I had a $10,000 profit in 1976. And Nick, my friend who owned the flower shop, said to me that he was going to be selling. I said, how much, Nick, are you asking for that flower shop? He said, $10,000. I thought it was a sign that I should buy this shop. And I said to him, Nick, do you mind if I come work in that shop a couple of Saturday afternoons before I go to the bar? He said, sure, but why? I said, well, maybe I'm a buyer. And indeed I did. I worked there a couple of weeks, thought I liked it, and I bought it. And I bought it, didn't give up my full-time job at St. John's, hired a buddy to run that shop. I did that because I had the idea not just to become a florist, which of course I did, but to build a business. So I built it with the idea that I didn't have to take the money out of the business because I had enough from my pay to cover housing and food and stuff. But I could take any money I made in the business and put it right back in. So I made the commitment every 6 months to open up another shop, which I did, and then it was every quarter. And 10 years later, I had something approaching 40 flower shops and realized that there was no economy of scale here in operating a chain of flower shops around the greater New York area. So I said, I have to figure out another way to go here.
And that's when you actually bought a brand. This is a fascinating story. Please keep going, and we'll move into the book because I think you've got a couple million solopreneurs that are leaning in right now that are thinking about the trajectory of your pivot. So keep going. What happens next? You were the owner of 45 flower shops across Manhattan.
40 in Manhattan, New Jersey,
Yeah.
the boroughs of New York, Long Island. So
Sorry, Jim, were they all the same name? Had you built some brand equity around this?
They were. They were called Flora Plenty, Flora Plenty, Plenty. And some I bought, some I opened from scratch. It was a combination. But I realized I was working harder and harder, and it really wasn't scaling. It wasn't getting more profitable. The brand was good. We were doing good top line, but it really was very, very tough to manage. And so I heard about this idea of, back in those days, Scott, it's embarrassing to say because it's so long ago, but it was in the early days of 800 numbers. It was a new and
Sure.
interesting phenomenon.
Sure.
And you had all these big companies like Sheraton Hotels spending a fortune on TV with kick line dances, singing songs, trying to get us to remember their 800 reservation number. And it worked because their number was 800-325-3535. But they were spending millions of dollars on creative and media to buy this time to get us to remember those numbers. And I thought, well, if they could just remember the alphanumeric equivalent on the keypad, and if I could get the telephone number 800 Flowers, I could maybe build a brand around that. And maybe it was a better way to go than one flower shop at a time. And it was a company in Dallas, Texas that launched with that 800 number. We became the fulfilling florist for them for the New York area. And it started to get some orders from them, and all of a sudden, bump, it just dried up. And I reached out to them. I said, guys, what happened? And they said, we ran out of money. We're about to close up. So they were in Dallas. I flew down to Dallas, and I said, geez, I really like this idea. Is the company for sale? Well, there's not much left. There's only literally one or two people. And they were boxing things up and selling things off. And I said, well, I'd like to buy it. So they put me in touch with this group that was the owners who were looking to get out from under some obligations. And being a smart aleck, a kid from New York, I decided I wasn't going to waste money on lawyers and accountants and bankers. No, why do that due diligence thing? So I did due negligence and wound up buying the company, and without representation, signed for this personally, and then learned over the next several months, no nefarious behavior, just nobody there, no record keeping. They owed out almost $7 million that I didn't know about, that I was now on the hook for personally. So it was a terrible decision on my part. It was a bad move, but it turned out good in the long run, because indeed we caught a little lightning in a bottle in that everyone in the flower business told us we were nuts because no one wanted to order flowers on the telephone. They didn't want to do it 24 hours a day. They certainly didn't want to use a credit card over the phone. No one's up in the middle of the night. Well, maybe there are some people up in the middle of the night, and they have needs to express themselves too. So even though everyone told us it wouldn't work and it was a waste of time and money, we persevered. And because we had to pay back this money over the next several years, we didn't have the room to make big mistakes. But it taught us to be agile and creative and find different ways to promote and get lucky. And we did, in fact, get lucky, because I met a fellow at a conference, and he was a bigger-than-life hero of mine. His name was Ted Turner, the creator of CNN and many other things, Turner Networks, owner of the Atlanta Braves at the time. And he was upset that he was the only 24-hour-a-day news network, and he wasn't getting the kind of advertisers he thought he deserved and wanted. He was getting a lot of 10 record deals, and you could Ginsu knives and things like that. And I said, well, I'd love to advertise on your network, but I really can't afford it. And he said, kid, we're going to teach the world that you can build a brand and sell the pork chops at the same time. I said, pork chops? I figured out what he meant. And indeed, that's a very, very lucky moment for me and for us. One, I got to hang around with this bigger-than-life guy and hang on his every word. And secondly, we built a brand, advertising on CNN. And then what happened, Scott, was an accident of history. This is back in the early 90s. The first Persian Gulf War was about to break out. We had amassed our troops over there after Iraq had invaded their next door neighbor, Kuwait, and we were about to rescue them. And I got a call from Carol, who worked for Ted, and who I got to know well. And she said, Ted would like you to do him a favor. I said, me do Ted a favor? What could I possibly do? And she said, all the advertisers are canceling because they're afraid to be associated with this. If this war breaks out, they don't want to be anywhere near it. And I said, what's Ted asking? She said, Ted would like you to leave your commercials on the air, not cancel. I said, well, I trust Ted's instincts, and if that's what he'd like me to do, he's certainly been good to me. I'm in. Then she called back a couple of days later and put Ted on, and Ted asked me to not only leave them on, but if he wasn't successful at convincing other advertisers to leave their spots on, and he had holes, would I agree to let him run my spots extra? So I figured I was already committed, why not? And indeed, the war did break in January, I think, of 91. And it went very, very well for the Allied forces and went very, very quickly. And we went from being very anxious and nervous about the outcome to being quite proud and proud of our troops and their performance and the things we'd accomplished in record-breaking time. And it was the war brought to you by 1-800-Flowers. So it was this enormous branding event for us because we were paying for a one share, maybe a less than a one share, and they were getting a 38, 40, 42 share because they were the only ones covering this 24 hours a day. And so it was a brand birthing event for us. And we had a few accidents like that in our history. And it was Ted who said, Jim, you have this most anonymous sounding company name, 1-800-Flowers, yet you're a real guy, a real florist with a real family behind this. And he's the one who suggested that I start appearing in the commercials to show that we were real people, we were a real company, a real family. And just because our name was so easy to remember doesn't mean it was just some kind of a boiler room someplace. It was a real floral company. So lots of good luck along the way.
What a great story. I was riveted listening to that. It also put Wolf Blitzer on the map as the Scud stud. Remember that back in the 90s?
Yes.
Jim, you are an iconic American entrepreneur. Of all the books you could choose to write now, Lodestar, you co-authored it with Dr. George Everly. Why did you name the book this name? And give us a quick primer on the tenets in the book.
Sure, Scott. It was a real labor of love for me. It was at the beginning of COVID, so this would have been COVID broke out here strongly in early to mid March, so March 11th, 12th, it really took hold here in the New York area. And we didn't know what was going to happen to our business. Would anyone need our flowers or Harry and David gift baskets or balloons or popcorn or cookies or chocolates? We didn't know if there'd be any business at all. How do we get our people that had to be remote? How do we get them connected? It was chaos. We didn't know what to do. And so we didn't feel like we could send out an email to our customers saying, hey, when you're in lockdown, we have a good gift you can send. It would have been inappropriate. And I had a young lady who was my chief of staff at the time. And she said, Jim, why don't you just write a letter to our community, sharing with them what this is, how it's impacting us, how we're dealing with this, and what our fears and concerns are. And so I did. And we started sending a Sunday newsletter, which we continue to this day to do. We don't try and sell in the newsletter. But we realize, especially during COVID, that it looks like we're in the flower business. And it looks like at Harry and David, we're in the gift food business. But in fact, we're in the relationship business. We're in the business of helping people to have more and better relationships. And when, in a bunch of different ways, and when it rises to the occasion that there's a gift appropriate, perhaps will earn their consideration. And so we call this newsletter that we write the Celebrations Pulse. And it now has a circulation of over 10 million people read this every Sunday, and we've continued to do it. In the very beginning, back in the spring of 20, we were getting lots of inquiries from our readers about, geez, what do we do with our 8-year-old kid who's out of school, is not having any social contact, he's trying to get online on the screen all day, and we think it's having really terrible impact on him socially and emotionally, physically. What do we do? And so what we did was we collected a group of people who we knew or got to know, who I thought were the preeminent experts, great psychologists, educators, to help us answer those questions. And we called that group the Connectivity Council. Well, in April of 20, I read a column, an article in Psychology Today, written by a fellow by the name of Dr. George Everly. And George speculated on how he thought this lockdown of COVID would impact our relationships, our deep personal, close relationships, family members, spouses, children, and casual relationships, the barista you see on a regular basis when you go for your coffee in the morning. And I thought it was brilliant. And I wrote him a fan letter. I said, Dr. George Everly, I read your piece. I think this is terrific. It's helped me to understand how this might happen. I hope we have occasion to chat sometime. And he wrote back to me and said, well, I'd love to chat with you. Why don't we make it happen? And we did. And I invited him to become part of our Connectivity Council. And we were doing a lot of work together in terms of relationships and impact, and I found him to be brilliant. And so for 2.5 years, we were COVID buddies. We never met in person. And I remember I was driving in Florida with my wife one weekend. We were down there, and I get a call from George, and I take it on the speaker in the car, and he said, Jim, I'm loving this work we're doing together on connection and community and relationships. And he said, clearly you're into it. I'm really into it too. He said, I have a suggestion. I said, what's that, Dr. George? He said, why don't we write a book together about this stuff? I thought, oh, George Everly, this brilliant man. I mean, I can't keep up with him. I can't carry his suitcase. But I was so intrigued by the idea of hanging with him, learning from him. So I looked at my wife, who gave me that look like, don't you dare, you're overcommitted already. So immediately I said, yes, George, I'd love to. She gave me a little whack in the arm. And we worked for 2.5 years on this project. And it was an excuse on my part to hang around with someone who's terrific, who's brilliant, who's one of the best people I know, and now become a very close friend. And I'm so lucky for the experience because all of those things worked out. We're very good friends. I enjoy every minute I spent with him and spend with him. And I learned so much from him. So we set out on this journey to look at, I didn't know this, but Scott, you probably know because of your work at FranklinCovey, but the self-help, the self-development, self-improvement is an industry. Does about $10 billion a year. There, thanks to you at FranklinCovey, there are 85,000 copies of books in print on this subject. And so what we set out to do was say, look, there's a lot of good stuff out there, but it's not all good. And we decided to take a look at the things, the recurring themes that kept coming up in the really good work that's out there. And we cite so many of them in Lodestar. And, it got so, Scott, at one point, I couldn't keep up in our work sessions because George just great information after great information. So I started recording them because I have to listen to him again at night to try and learn as much as I could from him and about the subject with him. So it was a great experience with him. We had a small group of people working with his researchers and analysts on it, and it was just one of the great learning experiences of my life. And one of the things that Mark Twain wrote about, we quoted it in Lodestar, was if you're learning, you're forever young, and when you stop learning, you're old no matter what your age. And that's how I feel, and George and I are the same age, and he's very learned, and I'm very old.
Jim, when you are looking for your next project, you should be hosting a mastermind or a masterclass for CEOs, chief experience officers on how to integrate in their priorities their relationship with their employees, their customers, and the communities, because I think too many organizations have lost track that they're in the relationship business. No matter what it is they are selling, what the service is, everyone is in the relationship business, and you are an expert on that. Let me pivot to the book. Your tagline in Lodestar, which, by the way, the definition of a Lodestar is one that leads, inspires, or guides. You share 10 timeless pillars of success. And as you mentioned, you dip into a lot of books that are in the space and share insights around them. And number 6, chapter 6, you call it Cultivate Resilience. Sorry, it's chapter 5. You call it Don't Worry, Be Happy, Letting Go of Depression, Shame, and Guilt. I mean, you share some great stories in there about letting go. That's a tough thing for high-performing entrepreneurs and leaders to do. We perseverate, we fixate. How would you boil that down into a couple of practical takeaways on why did that make it to one of the pillars? Why is it so hard? And where do we start?
Listening to you ask the question, Scott, I'm reminded of another man who became a friend and a hero of mine. And he said something to me early in my business career that stuck with me the rest of the time. His name was Wayne Huizinga. Wayne Huizinga created Blockbuster, Waste Management, Extended Stays of America Hotel, Auto Nation, 5 different Fortune 500 companies, Republic Industries. one of the great entrepreneurs this world has ever seen. And I had the privilege of spending some time with him, especially early in my career. And I'd run into him every few years. And he was always bigger than life for me. And we were sitting in his offices in Fort Lauderdale, in his big, beautiful conference room one time. And that he would speak to me that we were in the same league was just a joke, but so flattering. And he said to me, Jim, look, you and I make as many mistakes as anybody else. He said, no, we make more. We make more. But the difference between us and so many other people, let's call it the 90%, we get over it. We pick ourselves up, we dust ourselves off, and we get on with it. And that's the definition of resilience. But in terms of the shame part, what he taught me there was the best thing to do when you make a mistake is make it a learning lesson and make a joke out of it. Because if you can laugh at it, you won't be shameful about it. So he started telling me stories about his failures, about trying to do a closing on Christmas Day of a sanitation company he was buying, and having two closings going on in two different rooms, and completely mixing up who he was talking to, and say, hey, you're my good buddy Ed, and it wasn't Ed, it was Bob. And he'd always be telling stories about his own mistakes and failures. And he'd have a big smile on his face, he'd make fun of it. And he taught me that was a technique he used to overcome his shame, that it wasn't shame if he could laugh at it. He said, because if someone else had done that and you saw them do it, you'd think it was hysterical. But because it's yourself, you're embarrassed, and all of a sudden it can creep into becoming you're ashamed of the mistakes you made. And he said, that's no good for us because we're entrepreneurs. And he was one of the first people I heard use that term, entrepreneur. In fact, he won the Entrepreneur of the Year award that EY, Ernst & Young, gave out, as did I a few years later. And so that's how we got to spend time together at their events and judging things together. And I used to hang on his every word. But he taught me, we pick ourselves up, we dust ourselves off, and we get on with it. And I have to remind myself of that often, as I suspect even someone as successful as you, Scott, has to do. But the other part of it is make a joke out of it. And there was a young lady who worked for us at Flowers, and she ran merchandising for us, and she was a terrific talent. And I had made a bunch of doozies in terms of products that I would sell that did nothing. And so she created a wall with a couple of, 3 different bookcases. And she made a sign called Jim's Wall of Shame. And she put all of my worst selling ideas ever on this wall of shame. And people were like, oh my God, you're making fun of the boss like that? Are you out of your mind? And the fact that I'd come by and high five her, and we'd take everybody in, new employees, and take them over to Jim's Wall of Shame to show them all the mistakes I'd made, things I thought would be hits that were bombs. One I remember was I thought we could sell anything as long as it had flowers on it. So we did a catalog, and it had all giftable items in it, and they all had flowers on it, and it was a bomb. And the biggest bomb of all was like a satin shiny jacket, like a baseball jacket. No, it was for gals, so it was that style, like a bolero style. And it had this beautiful embroidered rose on the back of it. And Scott, if you're interested, I think there's a warehouse near Baltimore that still has several boxes of those if the moths haven't gotten to them already.
Oh,
but yeah, I learned from Wayne that if you can laugh at yourself, you can compartmentalize these and push them to the side.
You mean kind of like my 3rd book where there's 2,000 copies in my garage still? Fortunately, I wrote a couple that sold well beyond that. My favorite story in the entire book. What's that?
You mentioned that there are a lot of HR professionals in your audience, Scott, and I think that this is one of the most interesting and challenging times that we'll ever see HR professionals face that I've ever seen, and likely will see for a long time. And I think it's daunting right now what's happening in the workplace as a result of COVID, as a result of the introduction of remote work, and now the impact of AI. Because here at the Flowers companies, we're trying to prepare ourselves for the fact that, oh my goodness, we're going to be hiring all kinds of new talent into the company. We are. At the same time, certain work functions, if you're not looking at how can I automate my work function, how can I use AI to do this more efficiently and better, how can I free up my time so that I can do only the things that a human can do and make sure that if an AI capability can do it, that I'm pushing it into that, then you can be assured your boss is doing that, according to my friend Seth Godin. He said, if you're not getting your job AIified, your boss will do it for you, and that will have dire consequences. So we're going to see lots of people walking out one door of the company while people with different talents are going to be walking in the other side. And what does that do for HR professionals in terms of training people and investing in people and the marketing and communication messaging that goes along with that? I think this is unprecedented times for people in the HR world.
Let me dive a bit deeper there. Seth is a friend of mine as well, was on the program a few weeks ago. Seth likened AI second only to electricity in terms of disruption of business. I had the privilege last week of being in Manhattan at Keith Ferrazzi's Innovators Conference, and it was the Chief Economic Development Officer at LinkedIn that said in this conference, it was 100 of the nation's most preeminent CIOs and CHROs. They came together.
And what were you doing there?
Exactly. Well, fortunately, I'm Keith's speaking agent, so I slipped in the back door. But here's basically the consensus. In 5 years, robots will be doing all of the work, AI will be doing all of the critical thinking, and humans will be doing everything related to relationships and social engagement. And that did not seem like a bombastic statement to me. Let me rewind a little bit. Was there a company that you bought or a product or service that you bought and integrated into the Flower brand that worked extremely well or was a total nightmare? What could we learn from that?
Well, yes. All of the above. And I think the common element on those that were successful were the relationship efforts that were made. The most recent one, we purchased a company we've been working with for 4 years. The name of the company is Cardile. And Cardile is the new way that people will do greeting cards. So it's got an AI foundation, it's got a network of creative folks all over the world that produce the creative. And instead of having to go into a store, thumb through a whole bunch of cards that you have no idea what they say, and trying to find something that doesn't say anything that would be contrary to what you want to express to someone, now you can design exactly what you want, say what you want, get an assist from our AI engine to compose the poem you'd want to leave in there, write in the card, the limerick you want to say, the expression you want to leave, have it all, sign it in your own handwriting and have it posted and put it in the mail, delivered tomorrow or the next day, anywhere in the country. Or you can send it digitally, and that's a free. And that company had worked with us for 4 years on a contract basis. And finally, they came to us. We're so brilliant at seeing the future. They came to us and said, you know, we're a startup. We started here at the university at Virginia Tech, incubated here. We're a dozen talented young folks with our professor as our mentor and now our CEO, great computer science PhD. And they said, you have hanging around your office all the things we need to grow. And so we're doing well, but we could go so much faster if we were part of your company. And I said, you know, they're absolutely right. And so we purchased them earlier this year. And now they're really going fast, and they're helping us go. But it's because we said to them, yes, as the CEO, his name is Adam Donato, said to me a few months ago, all my friends said, acqui-hires never work. And he said, well, I'm not sure this is an acqui-hire, but it sure seems to be working to me. And the point was that he said, you guys took the time to invest in us, to get to know us, explain to us where you're going, and say, yes, we want you to do your earn your money. And he says, we're going to do that. We're sure of that. But you made it a point to tell us about your vision of the future so that if we were interested in buying in and signing up for the long haul, that opportunity was available to us. And the three leaders have come to us in the recent months and said, we're in on that. And so not only has it worked, it's worked better than we could have imagined because it was an investment in people and it was an investment in relationship. And it was an expression of these are our dreams. They've helped shape ours. And now it's our collective dream and they're very much a part of it. And when it hasn't worked, it's because we haven't taken the time to invest in the time and effort into the relationships that make those long-term dreams a possibility.
I'm sure that's a principle across every acquisition that worked well and failed in most companies. Let's end with my favorite story in the book about John Jay College. It's actually in chapter 5 around choosing a different narrative, but I think it's the best illustration of the first principle, which is changing your mind. Would you tell the whole story about going to school, what worked and didn't work for you as a student, and then build a bridge years later when you join this board and they're talking about longevity and tenure and years? I want you to connect point A to point B and tease out that lesson. Because when I read it, it got me thinking a lot about my own narrative around, the way it's supposed to be or the way it should be. And is my business as a literary agent and a talent agent, am I doing things the way the industry is doing it, the way I think it should be done? It really inspired me, the whole John Jay College story.
I think what you said there in your comments, Scott, is really important. That is, we should own our narrative. How we frame things, how we retell things, how we come to see things is how they are. And I don't think we spend enough time on our own narratives, and we leave it to other people to tell our narrative. So on the point on John Jay, I went to school after I was escorted to the edge of campus on my first college experience and told never to return. I wound up enrolling in John Jay, which is part of the City University of New York, and it was a police college. Remember I said I thought I'd become a policeman. Well, I was working there I was working at St. John's Home. I was going to John Jay part-time. I was now married and starting a family, and I had my flower shop, so I was a busy dude. And not a lot of sleep involved, but I was asked, well, let me tell you the first part of it at John Jay. 20 years ago, I'm at a big whoop-de-doo conference in Aspen, Colorado that an investment bank is putting on. And there's a group of 10 people around the table at this event. None of us knew the other until that night. I was with my wife. And a lady across the table tried to get the conversation going and asked if there was an educator in our life that really made a difference in our world. And when she got to me, I started to say, I thought about it, and I said, yes, there was a woman who was a teacher at John Jay. She was a PhD. She was a spitfire. She had a big afro. She wore like short skirts and big boots. And you remember, just a classroom full of police officers off duty and firemen. And she was provocative, and she'd get the class rocking about Constitution and history. And I said, Mike, I couldn't wait for this class because it really, I said, and she said, and the lady probed across the table and said, well, how did she have an impact on your life? I said, well, she taught me about different styles of education and how getting people involved and engaged really makes a difference and help them to learn. And I said, so she said, was she the most impactful educator in your life? I said, surely she was. And then she said to me, have you ever told her? I said, oh, no, I haven't. And then she said, are you talking about Blanche Cook? I said, yes, how did you know that? She goes, she's a good friend and a neighbor of mine back in New York. She said, I have a piece of advice for you. Blanche would love to hear that story. Why don't you tell her? So I made it a point. I got back in New York. I went and looked up Dr. Blanche Cook at John Jay. And we had a great reconnection, and we stayed connected. It's almost 25 years now. We've been good friends ever since, and she's gotten to know my family, and I'm so glad this lady, as a conversation started around a table, inspired me to reconnect with Blanche. And she just retired recently. She's professor emeritus at City University, John Jay College, and just a wonderful woman. But then I was asked to join the board of John Jay, and we're at an offsite, and the leadership is saying, how do we get these young people, most of whom are first-generation college kids, to graduate promptly in 4 years? And she says, my goodness, some of our kids are taking 6 and 7 and 8 years to graduate. I said, excuse me, but I think we should be focused on a mission here. And our mission is to help first-generation people get to college, help them understand about the careers in law enforcement and the judicial system and public safety, educate them for those and give them the opportunities. But most of the people I was in school with then, and so many of them that are still in the school now, are going part-time. They have a full-time job. They're trying to take care of their families. And I got to tell you that my 7 years at John Jay was 7 of the best years I ever spent in my life. Well, this woman who was preaching 4 years and out was horrified that one of the board members took 7 years to get through John Jay College. but it was true. And it's the mission they're on today. And it still is what I'm so proud of is they're there for young people. So many of them are working at least part-time, some full-time. And it's not your average college. And you're coming to go in and juggling so many things. But they used to run the same class twice a day. That's why it worked for me when I was running the Home for Boys. So they run the same class Mondays and Wednesdays, Tuesdays and Thursdays. So the policemen who changed shifts would have the same class taught at 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. So even if their shift changed, they can get to class that week. And it helps so many of us to be able to get through school and to improve our skills and provide for our families.
Well, it's a great story because the fixation, if you will, on 4 years is obviously it increases their matriculation rates and their
wrong
rankings.
Audience.
What's that?
It's the wrong audience, though.
Well, it's true, and I think as you wrote in the book, it was a focus on their rankings, right? How quickly can they get them done? And you were sort of pushing back and reframing, why rush it? It was some of the best time of my life, and the demographic isn't in that profile. What's the narrative? Exactly. So that has had a profound reoccurring impact on me thinking about my own business as well. Jim McCann, you are the co-author of the book Lodestar, Tapping into the Timeless Pillars of Success. Tell us, the world knows you as the founder and the face, if you will, thanks to CNN and the Gulf War and Ted Turner of 1-800-Flowers. What's on your horizon? What are you passionate about? What are you working on next?
Well, I'm very passionate about what we do in our day jobs at the Flowers Company. So 1-800-Flowers, Harry and David et al. And that especially this time of year. It's the time for people to have more and better relationships. And I'm happy about how my life's paths intersect. Doing this work for Lodestar has helped me to be better at trying to lead a group of talented people here at 1-800-Flowers. And what I've learned about relationships helps us to help our community to have more and better relationships. And a very selfish motivation there, Scott, because if our community has 5 or 6 or 10 more relationships in their lives because of the work we do together, that's 10 more birthdays, 10 more anniversaries that they might want to send a card or send a gift for.
Well, you have brought my mother in September, June, and December, which is her birthday, Mother's Day, and Christmas. A lot of joy for the last 30 years when I was in Utah and she was in Florida. So I appreciate you, your service, your passion, and your vision around what success looks like. Thank you, Jim, for your time today. Great discussion.
Scott, I can see why you've been so successful.
That's kind of you. And we will see you back here next week for a new conversation on leadership.